Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning from wherever you're joining. Welcome. We're at the Resilience Hub. My name is Lizzie Whitehead. I work for Mercy Corps. I'm a climate advocacy person, and I work on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. I'm joined in the room by Yue Chow from ODI, and he's going to talk to you later on about some of the research on climate finance in fragile states. And we're going to be joined online by a number of panelists, and I'll introduce them as we go along. Hopefully, for those online, if you can just be ready to try and get interactive. So if you can open Mentimeter on your phone or your computer, please do that, and we'll send you some codes in a little minute. For those in the room, please do the same. Try and get on your phones and open Mentimeter, because we'd really like to hear from you and hear who's in the room and who's with us. So today we're going to be talking about a humanitarian's view of the climate finance crisis. We're in the middle of week 2 at COP. We've heard a lot about finance pledges, announcements, and we're starting to hear a little bit more text in the draft text around vulnerability and trying to get finance to those who need it most. For the humanitarian organisations that you'll hear from today, that's our core business. So we're trying to relieve some of the most challenging concerns that people have around climate change, and they're suffering a nexus of climate, conflict, poverty, hunger, you name it. So today we're going to try and bring you a practitioner's view, and we're going to try and get you to get involved and ask us some questions and tell us about who you are and where you've come from. So if I can just ask to show the first slide, there's a Mentimeter code, and that will also find its way into the chat box on the platform. If you can click on that and come and join us. The first code is going to be on the screen in a little second. Adriana's going to share her screen. I think if I shout it out, it's 48658725. So that's 48658725. And we'd really like to know who you are, which organisation you're with, and just tell us something about where you're based, so we can get a bit of a flavour as to who's with us in the room. And then we can show the Mentimeter slide and hopefully start to hear from people. So the second question that you'll see on the Mentimeter is a bit of a question, and I'll give you a little bit of a hint. At the end, we're going to do a quiz, so please listen in so that you can win the quiz. There's no prizes. The second question we want to know is, how much do you agree or disagree with these statements? So the first statement, children and adolescents feel their right to education is compromised in times of emergencies. Do you strongly agree, slightly agree? So tell us what you think. And the second question, a dramatic shift is needed to increase the amount of finance that flows to frontline communities to help them prepare for and adapt to rising risks. Do you agree or disagree with those statements? And we'll maybe try and come back to those and reflect on what you feel and what you think. Okay. So I'm going to start and move into our presentations. And we're going to first hear from Yusuf, who is the country director for Concern Worldwide in Malawi. Yusuf has been programming climate finance for a long time. He's been working in DRR. And he's going to talk to us about what he sees as the climate crisis from his perspective. Who's he working with? What's changing? And what's the scale of the challenge, and maybe some solutions as well. So let me pass over to Yusuf. Welcome, Yusuf. Thank you for joining us. And please do take the floor.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm based in Malawi. So in today's discussion, I will share with you our experience in Malawi, the challenges, and some of the solutions. I will go into my presentation straight. Next slide, please. Malawi, the country has an estimated population of 18.6 million, which is expected to double by 2038. Malawi's water resources cover 21% of its territory and include Lake Malawi, the third largest freshwater lake in Africa. Malawi is one of the world's poorest countries with some of the worst human development indicators for a country not in conflict. For example, in the Human Development Index, it's at 174 out of 189 countries. Life expectancy is also very low in comparison with other countries. It currently stands at about 64 years. GDP per capita is $625, and 71% of the population is living below the income poverty line. And also in terms of gender indicators, it's not doing well. It's 145 out of 159 countries assessed. And by recently released report of concern and World Hunger ILFA, the global hunger index and Malawi stands at 81 out of 116 countries assessed. Next slide, please. In this slide, I will share with you some of the challenges, including the poverty and vulnerability of the most of the population living in the country. Majority of the people, their livelihoods rely on subsistence and rain-fed agriculture, and are so heavily dependent on the climate. With rain-fed agriculture so central to rural livelihoods, households are particularly vulnerable to climate-related shocks and stresses, including floods and droughts, and increasingly the environmental degradation. Performance of other sectors is also dependent on agriculture, which, as I said, is largely rain-fed and hence highly vulnerable to climate change and climate variability. Research summarized by Future Climate for Africa points to two trends in the country. The first is rising temperatures. It is estimated by 2040 there may be more than 100 days a year about 30 degrees centigrades compared to about 10 today. The second is that while there may be fewer rainy days in the future, when it does rain, it's likely to pour. This is a recipe for floods, droughts, and shorter rainy seasons. Chronic poverty also results in a heightened exposure to a range of risks beyond climate change, including illness, death of members of households, pest outbreaks, and of course, COVID. Dysfunctional markets, high food prices, and price volatility have also contributed to increased hunger and food crisis. High population growth, it's not just climate change that is hurting farming. A growing population has meant decrease in farm size. And today, the average plot is 0.8 hectares, less than the area of a football pitch, for example. And there is also lack of financial services and infrastructure, especially credit, which is very limited and very, especially for small, older farmers. For example, formal microfinance programs have very strict conditions, such as high interest rates, short repayments, which disfavor the poor, and particularly women. And a very high dependence on a single crop, that is maize, for both consumption and sale, make small scale farmers highly vulnerable to climate and economic shocks. And this also negatively affects their nutrition, especially for children under 5 years. Next slide, please. Here I will give you an example of Cyclone Idai, which hit Malawi in March 2019 and left a devastating path of destruction. Close to 2 million people were affected and hundreds were killed. Total effects are estimated at over $370 million, with severe damage to roads, bridges, houses, power lines, irrigation, infrastructure, and sadly, to the crops which were nearly maturity. Next slide, please. It is sometimes hard to take in hard facts and figures. So today I wanted to briefly share with you a story about a lady we worked with. Her name is Fanny Kaperi. That fateful night of March 2019 will forever live in the memory of Fanny and her 6 grandchildren. What began as a normal evening quickly descended into an unforgettable nightmare as intensive rain battered the roof of her house, destroyed the little food and belonging that she had. And she also lost all her crops. Next slide, please. Humanitarian and development organization, including Concern, we have in the recent past implemented resilience programs and interventions, and we have evidence about several interventions which can improve resilience of vulnerable households to shocks and stresses, including climate resilience, resilient livelihoods, and increased assets. Based on our experience that complementary livelihood intervention can improve the productive capacity and asset base of vulnerable households and build longer-term resilience to climate change, as well as degrading natural resources. In the collaboration of the government, we support establishment of effective forecast-based early warning system that can link community to national level through an improved data management and response system, which can protect people like Fanny from suddenly hit by disasters. And it is proven that the poor and vulnerable households need additional assistance, particularly in the lean season, to protect them from restoring to negative coping strategies, selling assets, and sliding further into destitution after a shock. And also access to high quality, affordable agriculture inputs, information, and capital increase of household can also decrease their vulnerability to shocks and stresses. And based on our experience, we see the very good role for the private sector in leveraging their interest as well as resources to improve small household farmers' crop yields and crop diversity, as well as increase their access to markets so they can buy inputs and sell their produce. Next slide, please. And of course, there are remaining challenges. We have very limited resources and we are not able to reach many people as according to the needs. And in the current situation, the communities where we are working, they are facing multiple challenges, and we call them 3C: COVID, conflict, and climate impacts that are having serious impact on their food security and making poverty reduction even more difficult and costly. And also there is a fear that all the development gains we have had in the last few decades, we may lose them. And also the climate related funding has often been unpredictable and erratic. So we asked for reliable, long-term and need-based funding. This is an excellent opportunity, the COP26, that high-income countries need to make progress on their commitment, which was made a number of years ago, that is 100 billion annual. And also to look at how to adequately fund the communities that need it most now and also from 2025 onward. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Yusuf. That was a great overview of both strategic views that you're seeing, but also that case study as well. That was fantastic. If we can just go to the slides, Lizzie's slides, I'll just flick you through some of the data that Mercy Corps has been trying to analyse. And I'm sure it's not a shock to anybody who's listening, but it's actually really difficult to understand climate finance flows, especially those that are flowing to fragile states. there isn't really an agreed way of publishing this information, and the OECD data from 2019 was released a few weeks ago. So we did what we could to try and crunch some of the statistics for you today and try and make them as understandable as possible. So if you look on the graph that you can see on the screen, again, it's no surprise there's more money going to mitigation than there is to adaptation. But if you look at that very tiny line that's just about visible on the bottom, that is the amount of money that is going to fragile states. So it's minuscule, and it's really not meeting the needs and the demands that we're seeing as humanitarians in these countries. If we go to the next slide, we've tried to put that into a per capita view. So when we've analysed how much climate finance money for adaptation is going to different countries, we've ended up putting them into 3 buckets. So we have a least fragile and vulnerable bucket, an intermediate fragile and vulnerable bucket, and a most fragile and vulnerable bucket. So the colours, the deeper the colour is basically the less money that's flowing. So up in the top left here, Lesotho's getting quite a lot of money per capita, but it isn't classified as highly fragile. On the bottom right, where the red circle is, that's where some of the most challenging contexts are. That's where the most vulnerability is. That's where the most fragile countries are. And again, no surprises, the money is tiny that's flowing to them. On the next slide, we've zoomed in a bit. So you can see in that bottom right-hand corner, we have Sudan, DRC, Afghanistan, and in the very, very bottom, which is almost unreadable, is Yemen. So some of the most fragile people in the world who live in Yemen are receiving per capita the least amount of climate finance for adaptation. And as humanitarians, we actually believe that that's unjust. It's just not where we should be in 2021. On the next slide, we've tried to understand who is actually funding climate adaptation in fragile places. And surprise to us, actually, almost half of the money flowing was coming from the World Bank. There's a bit of bilateral money. There's very little multilateral funding. And as you'll hear from some of our speakers later on, there's a message about funders going to safe places and finding it too difficult to fund climate adaptation in more fragile places. And it is difficult, but that's not really an excuse to not do it. And I think it's the last slide. We've just tried, if we can go to the next slide, we've just tried to compare and put into perspective how much climate adaptation money is being spent compared to money that's spent on defence. So on the kind of left-hand group on the bottom axis, you've got increasing fragility. At the far right, you've got the top 25 most fragile countries. And the red is just a sea of red. There's so little green boxes of adaptation. There's so little money flowing if you compare it to how much is spent in defence. And again, we just believe that that's not where we should be in 2021. So to get a better look at some of the needs and the local demands and whether or not they're being met, I'm going to pass you over to Yue Kao, who's a senior researcher at ODI. He's been involved in a number of significant and regional research projects, and he's going to tell us more about what that research has found. And do listen in, because that's part of the quiz at the end. So Yue, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lizzie. Just waiting for the slides to come online. Anyway, I'll start. Thank you everyone for being here, wherever you are in the world. And thank you, Lizzie, for inviting me to participate on this panel today, where I would like to provide a research-based perspective on this issue. So, next slide, please. At ODI, we have recently released a report together with Mercy Corps through the SPARK program, looking at the challenges and the barriers for climate adaptation finance to reach countries that are either fragile or affected by conflict. Next slide, please. And in our study, we have focused on the Sahel and Horn of Africa region, because it's a region that has a high concentration of countries that are either fragile or conflict affected, as you can see in this figure. And more specifically, in addition to looking at the region as a whole, we've also done 3 country case studies in Mali, Somalia, and Sudan. Next slide, please. Now, the question is enough money getting to this context? Next slide, please. Well, from a quantitative perspective, next slide, between 2010 and 2018, we can see that global adaptation finance was 78 billion US dollars. So going to the whole world. Out of this, next slide, 8% went to the countries in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, amounting to around 6 billion US dollars. And just to put these two numbers in perspective with all the public finance that is available out there, next slide, global ODA between 2010 and 2018 was 1.3 trillion US dollars. So as a share of that, as a share of global ODA, adaptation finance that went to the Sahel and the Horn of African countries was only 0.4%. So a very limited amount. Next slide, please. Now, if we expand our view to include also other types of financial aid flows, say to include disaster risk reduction finance, humanitarian finance, next slide, we can see that ODA that went to the Sahel and the Horn of Africa over the same time period was 235 billion US dollars. Next. And out of this, only 5% went for climate mitigation and adaptation purposes. So it is still somehow a limited amount. Next, please. Now, if we zoom in at the country level, this graph plots the cumulative adaptation finance per capita over the same time period against the level of fragility for each country in the region, and then compares it to countries in other income groups. And there are two key trends that can be observed here. The first one is that it seems that the more fragile a country is, the less adaptation finance it has received. And as a matter of fact, if you look at, I hope you can see it, Senegal, which is the only country that is not fragile, classified fragile in the region, is the one that has received the most amount of money. The second trend that you can see here is on the right-hand side of that figure, is that many countries, a lot of countries in this region have received, on average, less money than the least developed countries. And these are countries that have a similar level of socioeconomic development, and to a certain extent we can say that they can be a comparison group. But I think out of these, which is personally even more concerning, is that several countries in this region have received even less money than countries in higher income groups. And this is problematic because logic will dictate that as the level of socioeconomic development increases, then arguably they need less external support. But this is not actually what's happening. Next. Now, this problem of money or of adaptation finance not getting to the, where it's most needed, or like where the countries that are most climate vulnerable, is also something that we've observed at the subnational level. And this is just an example from Mali, coming out of our research. This figure shows the level of climate vulnerability in the country, and as you can see, it is the areas of the country that are least vulnerable are also those around the capital, Bamako, and also towards the west of the country, whereas those that are the most vulnerable are the ones that are in the north and the east of the country. So you would just expect that adaptation programs and projects have targeted those countries most. Next. But this is actually not what we've observed. So if you can see from this figure, the majority of adaptation projects have tended to focus around the capital and in the west of the country. And one of the key reasons for this, among others, is the perceived risk of operating in those other regions that is dictated by conflict and other issues that contribute to fragility. Next. As you can see in this next figure, right? This one shows you the reported violent events between 2010 and 2018, and you can see that they have tended to concentrate around the Mopti region and the Gao region. Next, please. Now, from a qualitative perspective, we found that there are three key types of categories of challenges why adaptation finance is not flowing to these kind of countries and contexts. Next. The first challenge is that conflict worsens the problems of accessing climate finance for partner countries. So if you think about the usual problems that low-income countries have in accessing climate finance, which are mostly, have to do in meeting fiduciary, social, and environmental standards, these tend to be exacerbated by conflict dynamics. And this creates a problem where especially in the countries that we've done the deep dives, Mali, Somalia, and Sudan, especially in Mali and in Sudan, the majority of climate finance is currently being channeled through international organizations, so UN organizations and the multilateral development banks. In Mali and in Sudan, still, there are no national entities that are accredited to the multilateral climate funds, so say the GCF and the GEF. And compounding this problem of low capacity is the high staff turnover and loss of institutional memory that you can find these kind of like places. The second point, which is sort of like the reverse of the medal of the first one, is that the requirements of donors to access climate finance tend to be too rigid and complex. And from what we've observed, they tend not to account for the rapidly changing context of fragility, crisis, and conflict. The third point of this is that oftentimes the minimum socioeconomic data and climate data that you will usually require to put in program proposals to multilateral climate funds, but also other donors, is missing because of conflict dynamics. Say either because conflict has destroyed the physical infrastructure that you need to gather and monitor climate data, or because project teams or program teams cannot physically access areas of the countries that are under the control of non-state groups. Next, please. The second types or categories of challenge that we've observed is that donor risk appetite and tolerance do not support adaptation finance reaching the most vulnerable communities. I've already showed you the figures from Mali, and then you've seen that in the country there are hot spots where adaptation programs are happening and cold spots. And one of the key reasons that we found in our research why this is happening is that the nexus of climate change and conflict and fragility tends to be a new focus area for a lot of donors, both bilaterals but also multilaterals. So a lot of them still don't have the strategies, the policies, the operational guidelines to basically reorient their operations to be able to stay engaged a long time in this kind of environments. And without explicit guidance and policies on these subjects, there tends to be a dearth of expertise internally in terms of human resources for these people to engage in these topics, but also to be physically sent to this kind of context that arguably require the smartest people to be there to solve the complexity of the problems. And another thing that we observed is that donor coordination, and this is not new to anyone, is needed to further improve the geographic coverage of adaptation projects and programs. That's not to say that this is not happening. There are donor coordination platforms in these countries, but then we don't really know how well they're working currently. Next, please. And my last point, so the third categories of challenges that we observed, which is also one of the main questions that we try to answer in the research, is that to date, there's weak evidence of conflict sensitivity practices in adaptation programs. So from our research, it was uncertain if conflict analysis had been consistently applied at the design stage and also throughout the life cycle of projects. And in those cases, in those projects where projects had run those kind of analysis, by talking to key informants, we realized that there was still a lot of room to improve the quality of these assessments, especially to reflect the power dynamics at the local level. And a lot of the projects that are looking at this problem also have tended to focus on what we call being security aware when looking at conflict dynamics, meaning that they tended to look at how the conflict context would impact the project itself, but not or less so the other way around, how your own initiative and program could affect the conflict context. And also projects that did that, they tended to mostly show the positive impacts of being conflict sensitive rather than say upfront, oh, okay, there may be potential negative impacts. So that's just to say that we think adaptation programs and projects, how they're currently or have been in the past designed, have tended to miss opportunities for conflict prevention. I just want to give a caveat on these findings in the sense that conflict analysis is inherently political. So the fact that we weren't able to find a lot of evidence could also be to the fact that donors prefer not to release this kind of information because it's sensitive. Next slide, please. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Yue. I believe there's a question on the platform for Yue, but I can't actually see what the question is There was an earlier question about what do we mean by defence money, and I think the source of the defence data was on the slide, and we can pull that one up or share that with you directly if you want to get in touch with us. We'll try and pull up the question for UA and deal with that at the end of the next session. But let me just pass over to our next speaker. So I'm really pleased to introduce Sajan Nipani. He's with Mercy Corps in Nepal. Namaste, Sajan. He works on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance program. And he's going to talk to us and zoom in a bit. So what's climate finance really feel like at the local level in Nepal? What are their problems and challenges? What's he experiencing? So let me hand over to Sajan, please.
Thank you, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. Can I have my slides, please? Thank you. So in this session, I would like to share how financing at local levels is being done at Nepal, especially with the focus on disaster risk reduction financing. Next slide, please. So if we see the overview of climate change in Nepal, the global effect is predominantly seen in the Himalaya country of Nepal. The climate has warmed, the temperature has increased, the precipitation is decreasing, but the climate extremes are increasing, the extreme events are increasing. And it is clear that Nepal experienced significant disaster risks, and it is ranked on the top 31st among the countries in the informed risk interest, with the high risk of flood due to the high exposure and lack of the coping capacity. And in this current trend, we are expected to see increase in frequency and severity of the disaster and hazard, especially linked with the hydroclimatic and the changing climatic condition. Next, please. So in that event, as we know, recently we have gone to the restructuring of the country. So most of the activities that are linked with the communities and are done at the community level are focused, are channeled to the local governments. So local governments have a major responsibility of working at delivering the activities at communities, which also includes disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation activities. So these local governments get resources from various levels and various mechanisms. So these includes the grants from province and federal governments and resource and revenue sharing they generate. Also, various kinds of revenues like they generate from their administrative jurisdiction. Next, please. So these local governments possess various mechanisms for local level financing disaster risk reduction. One of the major policy is the National Federal Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act, which has several provisions that guarantees and that allows the local government to develop plans and programs and to generate the funding for the related activities. Another is the provision of Disaster Management Fund, which is also guided by the Disaster Management Act, which allows all the local governments to have some sort of money fund allocated for all sector of disaster risk reduction and for all phases of risk management cycle. So these mechanisms, along with the local plans and policies that the local governments prepare, are vital and crucial for budgeting climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction activities. Additionally, we are also seeing various levels of risk transfer mechanisms such as crop and wildlife damage insurance, which are being implemented, which are being piloted at several scales so that the local governments also, along with the local communities, can have the benefits of transferring risks so that they get minimal damage. Next, please. So in this event, we want to see, we had some of the activities, we had some research conducted in few local governments where we work, where we wanted to see how the local level budget allocation is done, how the local governments allocate budget for climate change adaptation, with more focus was provided on disaster risk reduction and flood resilience. The objective of the research was to increase awareness of the public spending by local governments so that we can see how the shared understanding of budgeting needs was done, how the budget was planned, and what were the criteria that the local governments take during the planning of these activities related to climate adaptation and risk reduction. So the methodology was to see the annual development plans and programs, budget allocated climate and adaptation related climate adaptation and disaster management related policies and guidelines formulated by the local governments. Additionally, some of the interviews at various levels of the government. So the budget allocation is done through in two categories. One is the primary sector, which includes direct budget linked to environment and disaster management. So this is a section that most of the local governments has allocated budget. And next section is the secondary section, which includes physical infrastructure, agriculture, and other sectors with perceived climate adaptation and risk reduction. But the budget and the resources allocated to these sectors do not they're linked with the activities that are related to climate and risk reduction, but they can be seen as they also relate to the activities serving their major sectors such as infrastructure or agriculture. Next, please. So what we see from this research is that the local governments, the 7 local governments where we saw the budget allocation, the total amount of the budget allocated in environment and disaster management section is very less compared to the total budget. The section of the budget in these sectors we can see is from 0.1 to around 3%. So we can see very less percentage of the budget has been allocated to environment and disaster management sector by these local governments. Next, please. And according to the disaster management cycle, if we see the budget, the major part is spent in response and mitigation. Mitigation here refers to risk reduction measures. The pre-event ex-ante investment, especially for the preparedness part, is very low. We can see and this resembles most of the local governments here in Nepal. So the local government's investment or the allocation in preparedness section of the disaster management cycle, mostly for the non-structural preparedness, is very less compared to the other spending in these municipalities. So we can see the response part gets a significant portion, and the mitigation part also gets a significant portion at these municipalities. Mitigation mostly includes the infrastructure investments such as irrigation, culverts, and various river training works that has been done at these areas as these areas lie on the southern part of Nepal, which are mostly affected by the floods every year. Next, please. So if we see the challenges, most of the challenges at the local level are because we see priority is given on investment demonstrating immediate and highly visible results. So most of the, as we also saw on the budget, the most of the portion is, the large chunk is on the investment or mitigation sector. That brings like most of the planning, during the planning and during the budgeting, priorities given on the investment or the structure or the hardware part of the overall disaster risk management plan. Whereas the knowledge part, knowledge gaps and the relationship and the community capacity building and involving the community and building their capacity in non-structural sector and how that can be linked to the broader deployment goals. This is quite missing in the local level deployment process. And also we can see the amount of budget allocated, but the expenses tracking is quite difficult due to the transparency of the budget expenditure. It's very difficult to see how the spending allocated as per the budget is done, because this has been done through the sectors. So we can track a budget according to the sector, like for environment or physical infrastructure or for education or for health, but the activity wise tracking so that we can see or we can share the transparency, and we can share the accountability with the local communities so that they can also take the ownership with, and also work with the local governments to make that spending more accountable and more transparent. And additionally, as the more focus will be on the annual meeting the annual budget targets, most of the activities lack monetary evaluation. So most of them are done very at the end of the fiscal year, and at that time it's a bit hard for the monetary evaluator to see whether these activities has been implemented so that they were implemented as they were planned to reduce the risk of disaster and climate adaptation. Next, please. So Mercy Corps, through the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance in Nepal, we are trying to focus or see how to incorporate disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation with focus on flood resilience in local development plans and programs, especially through the various levels of local disaster management plans, disaster preparedness and response plans, LDCRPs, which we call here. So these plans and programs has been crucial in incorporating risk reduction and climate adaptation into the development plans. So these plans provide activities along with the amount that are needed to implement, and these are integrated into the annual development process. So our efforts are now with we work with the local governments, and we mostly work with the community disaster management committees, CDMCs, which we call here, to advocate additionally with the local, sub-national and national governments to allocate and increase annual spending on this sector. So the previous figures we saw, we are trying to have at least 5% of the total annual budget to be implemented or to be allocated and spent on the disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation activities at these levels. So we are continuously working with these government levels and mostly facilitating the increased participation of vulnerable communities and marginalized groups through CDMCs, community disaster management committees, which are the first responders and first adapters to the climate change, as well as various risks and hazards that they face. So this overall integration and mainstreaming the process into development plan is our effort, so that we want to see the much more increased investment and improved policies on risk reduction with focus on flood resilience in this sector. Next, please. So, addition to the problems and addition to our works, we are trying to also share some of the solutions that can be done at local scale, and which we are doing, especially small scale and community-led investments and engagement. Along with the local governments, we are trying to engage or have some of the preparedness and mitigation solutions, mostly which includes the involvement of the local community with the local resources and with the available amount of the resources that they have, with the leveraging from the community as well as the local government budget. So these activities such as biodikes, which are planted along the floodplains, sugarcane and vegetation plantation, which provide both benefits, so that the local communities and the local people can also have some monetary benefits along with the risk reduction and flood control. And also engaging farmers and cooperatives to increase finance, so that they can engage themselves in enhancing climate adaptation, mostly with the farmers engaging with the cooperatives, which are mostly cooperatives related to agriculture and market development. So these linkage of farmers and cooperatives will certainly be one of the way that we are adapting, helping them to adapt to the changing climatic conditions. And market system development that certainly brings civil society, private sector, and farmers to increase resilience to floods, so that the above mentioned approaches will have a solution that brings that will create a more market, so that along with the risk reduction and adaptation, the monetary and economic benefit will certainly be supportive for the local communities to build their capacity and resilience. Next, please. Additionally, there are some of the recommendations how we can improve local financing, especially incentivizing local government investment through policies. As I said earlier, we are in the process of restructuring after our federalization of the country. So there are various steps and various processes that needs to be done, and incentivizing local governments with the improved policies on flood resilience, disaster risk reduction, and climate adaptation at local level will certainly be a way that local government can increase the investment. Additionally, as a part of development and as a part of humanitarian organization, we are working to support the local governments with the project and activities, some of the models that can be implemented at local level that will provide solutions, and that will certainly engage the communities and the local governments to provide short-term and long-term solutions to the risk reduction and climate adaptation. Additionally, engaging the market actors and local governments along with the communities will certainly be a way that we can help enhance small scale and local level climate and disaster risk reduction financing. Next, please. So that brings the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sajan.
Over to you, Lizzie.
Thank you. And it sounds like you've nearly lost your voice, so I appreciate you coming along at a very late hour for Nepal. Thank you. So we've heard that climate finance is really hard to track at a global level. Sajan's just explained that it's actually really hard to track within the national budget and down to the municipality in Nepal. Let's move now to another Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance partner with Plan International. And I'm going to introduce you to Cristina Perez, who is the National Disaster Risk Management Advisor with Plan in El Salvador. Cristina, it would be great if you could tell us more about what you're experiencing in terms of climate finance and the realities for especially women and girls and youth in El Salvador. So over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I will speak a little bit about the studies that we are carrying out. Please show the presentation. Well, first, I will explain a little bit that for Plan, making studies is very important, especially because we understand that the impacts on girls, adolescents, and women is very, very worrying. So for us, is very relevant to understand and to know how the climate change is affecting this population, and also gathering evidence on these impacts, because with this information, we influence to decision makers to reduce the negative effects on children and adolescents. Today, I will show you the results of a study carried out in El Salvador through the project Increasing Resilience to Floods in Central America, and a second study carried out in Zambia and Zimbabwe. The next slide, please. Well, to start, I would like to talk about the context of El Salvador. Well, El Salvador is located in Central America, and it's highly vulnerable to disasters. Like an example, 95% of our territory is vulnerable to threats, and 98% of the population is living in risk areas. So most of the country is in high risk all the time. Also, we are on the if you see the numbers related to the Global Climate Risk Index developed by Human Watch, we are positioned as one of the most affected countries in 2009. After some activities, we are still in position 11 in 2020. Also, according to the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, from 2012 to 2015, El Salvador has faced severe droughts, including the driest quarter from May to July 2015 in almost half of the century, registers at the national level. And some of the most strong impacts are related to the climate change, how disproportionately affects women, children, and elderly people due to vulnerability, especially to those families living in severe poverty conditions. Just to let you know how many population of El Salvador lives in poverty, we have more than 54% of the people living in poverty. So this represents a lot of the population of the country. The next, please. Well, we have the main results here. The next slide, please. Well, on the left, as you can see, the right to education significantly affects children. More than the 80% of the girls and boys and adolescents experience an increase of natural hazards, and they have their education interrupted between 1 to 3 weeks to the emergency that their communities have faced. But also, sometimes we have a situation with an interruption of 3 months or 4 months after a drought or landslide, and it depends on how the school have been affected. On the right, you can see that young people identify flooding as the most frequent hazard impacting their lives, with a 48% of girls and 35% of boys, reflecting that it has interrupted the right to education. Like I said before, we have a lot of threats as a country: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, but the floods are the most common. With the other information, according to the results from the research, the 84% of girls and 83% of boys have not been able to attend the doctor appointments due to disasters and hazards. So with this, we can conclude that health is also a right of children and adolescents, significantly affected by climate change. The next slide. Well, to explain this slide, I have to say that the population faces serious difficulties in absorbing impact from the environmental disturbances and abruptly adapt to a new reality. However, their capacity for transformation is affected by either knowledge, access to resources, and management capacity, or due to a community effective organization. This slide shows how boys and girls are affected in a differentiated way under rights according to their gender. For example, if we see education, we have a 48% for girls and 35% for boys. So you can see that girls are more affected than boys. Insecurity is the opposite. We have more people affected, more boys affected than girls, with the 11% and girls with 5%. If we talk about housing, the one who feels affected are girls. We didn't receive information for any boys, and this is because most of the girls don't have, for example, documents for the ownership of land. So this makes more harder to get when we have the impact of the climate change. We have more complicated processes to get proper titles or housing like that. The same happens with the environment. Girls recognize like a problem the right to a healthy environment, opposite to the boys, where almost anybody have a response related to the right of environment. And to the health, we have an answer for both, but it's more affecting for the boys, because we have 9% of the information gathering that boys are more affected of this right. We also ask a little bit more about education, and we asked if have they missed classes anytime due to an emergency or a disaster related to the climate change. And the 84 of the girls and adolescents provided a positive answer, and the boys showed an 82% in response to the same question. So we have a very similar percentage here. We have to explain a little bit more, but usually we didn't have any other study at the country level that shows enough information of the decision making. So we also asked about it. If we have the opportunity, like boys or girls, to be part of the decision makers, and we recognize and we gather a lot of information that suggests that girls have a very limited participation opportunities, and they are less empowered related to the rights that the boys. And this is because we don't have enough mechanisms, or some mechanisms are very limited to let them to participate. So this is one of the other things that we found. With the next slide, you will see two recommendations. We have some recommendation, and we proposed during the study to focus and propose action to the Ministry of the Environment, the Ministry of Education, the municipalities, and the community commissions to take action to solve these situations. As you can see, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, we think that it's very needed to promote a holistic public policy review, including multi-sector and hazards. Also to expand the participation of the different social sector, like business and institutions, to establish a public mitigation and adaptation policy to climate change that has to include promote the creation of an interinstitutional mechanisms of a local level coordination with decision-making actions to implement a policy at the national level, because right now it's very hard to do it. And also to promote the girls' voice in adolescents' participation through formal education, trainings, decision-makings among their communities toward the climate change. It means hear their voice. We also have some recommendation to the Ministry of Education. We need to strengthen and promote the national system of civil protection, strategize alternative formal education for emergencies. Also to expand alternative educational and continuous remote program, taking into consideration the access and coverage. Also, children need to continue with the right to education within a disaster context, what is not possible to continue in the formal education system. So it's very hard to meet. And if we talk with the municipalities, and especially with the Municipal Civil Protection Committee, that are the people in charge of solve or respond to the disasters or emergencies, we suggest to incorporate conservation practices into their operational plans, including cleaning campaigns, solid waste management, environmental education, some economic initiatives, especially related to recycling, use of plastic or less use of plastic, and things like that. And finally, utilize a multi-sectoral approach, including the private sector, churches, and other local actors that are not being part of these important spaces. So I think it's very important to include all these people. Well, on the next slide, I will explain a little bit about the study that we made in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and it's called Adolescent Girls in the Climate Crisis, Voices from Zambia and Zimbabwe. The next slide shows some of the research typology. At first, we need to explain that feminist participatory action research on how climate change impacts on adolescent girls and young women's access to education in Zambia and Zimbabwe, because education is one of our main focus, like plan. Research was centered on a carried out by young women researchers to include them as part of the study. Also, 16 young women researchers leading this project spoke to over 160 girls and young women aged between 14 and 19 years old. Approach empowered the girls and young women themselves to document their experiences of how they are affected by the climate change, and includes recommendation for different actors and support for young women to undertake local advocacy. And the next slide, I will explain a little bit about the identification of gendered climate impacts. Well, to understand a little bit more, I will explain that the most common impacts are related to floods, strong winds, increase in pests, shifting rainfall patterns, and recurrent droughts, which have the resultants in food insecurity for most of the communities. So the girls assert that as a result of the climate-induced economic and livelihood shocks, many girls are taken out of school and become more vulnerable to early marriage. So as you can see, this is a common element between the two studies. We have a lot of problem with education, especially for girls. Also, due to the patriarchal nature of the communities, there were few instances of anywhere the young women could contribute to decision making at household and community level. So this is also another of the common situations that are happening in these countries. We don't have enough mechanisms or spaces to let the girls and adolescents to be part of the decision makings. On the next slide, you will see the identification of gender climate impacts, specifically on education. Well, here I will read a little bit. One of the findings are that climate change reduces the availability of foods, and parents' attention is diverted from sending children to school to sourcing food. Also, where parents can only afford to pay fees for some of their children, they give priority to the boys and not to the girls. Also, children have to endure climate-induced weather extremes during classes, and girls from poor families cannot afford winter wear such as shoes, socks, and jersey. So this is affecting their education also. Household chores are either before or after classes and leave no time for homework or after school studies. So we are double affecting, as we cannot just go, they cannot just go normally to the school, but also they don't have enough time for homework. Also, we have the inaccessibility to water that affect girls' menstrual hygiene. Girls miss classes during their menstrual cycle, especially in instances where they don't have access to water. So for the next slide, we decide to give some recommendations. Well, not we, the girls and adolescents give some recommendations. At first, girls and young women recommended that communities should take action to address the looming challenges in climate change, and this includes changing behaviors and practices and ensuring that communities adopt better ways of managing the environment. Also, they call upon governments to mitigate the impacts that are faced by girls and young women, especially those that affect their access to and attendance in schools. Recommendations included that need to build more schools, changing the school calendar to accommodate for altered seasons, and establishing satellite schools, as well as including climate change in a school curriculum. Also, the young women call communities and families to reduce the vulnerability of girls and young women by avoiding the practice that face with climate-induced crisis. They sacrifice the education and welfare of girls and young women by marrying them off. And also for civil society organization and other players, including the private sectors, the girls and young women recommended setting up programs that enhance the community resilience to climate change and the creation of alternative climate resilient livelihoods. So as you can see, the next slide is just to say thank you. And thank you for letting us to show what is going on with girls and adolescents and boys because of the climate change.
Thank you, Christina. That was a really comprehensive view at your research, and that's available on the floodresilienceportal.net. the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance knowledge database, which has a wealth of research that comes from our practical programs. So it's coming from practitioners on the ground. So thank you, Christina. So we've heard almost a global tour of real life examples and countries. We've heard from Sahel, Horn of Africa, a deeper dive into Mali, Malawi, Nepal, El Salvador, Zambia, Zimbabwe. So these are real experiences from real people working with people in the most direst needs in these countries. So if you have any questions for the panel, please do put them into the chat box. It'd be really great to hear from you. If you've got any questions in the room, please do come up and grab the mic and tell us what you're interested in. In the meantime, I'm going to take you back to Menti. So I'm going to share the next one. 2 seconds. There we go. If I can, there we go. So if you can go to the code 60214577. So we've got another 2 days left of COP. We've seen the draft text. If you could go and speak to somebody here and talk about the climate finance crisis, maybe as a humanitarian, what is it that you would say? What do you want them to listen to? There's been a lot of pledges. There's still a huge amount of road to travel in terms of getting more money for adaptation. As you can remember from one of our first slides, there's a tiny fragment. I think 1% of climate adaptation finance goes to fragile states. There's a long road to travel to get the money to the people who need it the most. So if you could speak to somebody here at COP who would turn that into some text for the UNFCCC, what is it that you want them to really understand? Do they need to think more about women and girls? Christina gave us a really sharp overview of the really different impacts and negative impacts that are felt by women and girls. Children not in education, children not having access to hygiene, the infrastructure impacts that Sajan told us about in Nepal. So even when the government signs up to percentages within budgets to get money to the national level, that's just the start of the job. There's a huge amount still to come after that. So what would you say to these people here at COP? So somebody's told us the world has never been richer. Why can't we find the money to adapt to what is now expected to be a dire future? Agree. We must find ways to ensure communities affected by conflict receive climate funding. And we know that that's difficult, but it's possible. And we've talked to you today about some of those examples, and there's plenty more. Wake up, private sector. You need to stop business as usual and invest in climate finance. Agree. And I think there's still quite a lot of demystifying that we need to do around what is it exactly that the private sector can do with finance on adaptation and in challenging places. I think there are options, but it takes a little bit of unpacking to really help people understand that. Point out that we always undermine our long-term success by short-term gain. Stop procrastinating. Yes, and that came out in Sajan's presentation, where money was flowing to places that were most visible, some of the big infrastructure projects, and that definitely has an impact, but actually some of the invisible things are the ones that need the money the most. Pay now, invest in the future of our grandchildren's friends. Exactly. Let's think about future generations. We need locally led adaptation, both on the ground and in the COP cover text. Yes, and why is it so difficult to get there? What is it that's stopping that? What's the political economy of some of these decisions that are happening around us here at COP? Get money to the people who need it most. Pay now. Climate change is universal and apolitical. It impacts us all now or at a time soon. Actions and solutions need participation. Yeah, it's always difficult to invest in things that aren't in the next couple of years, and it's really, our brains aren't wired to think about something 50 years down the line. We find it really hard to understand risks that are further along the chain. Brilliant. I'm going to take you on to our last little quiz. So I did warn you that we were going to quiz you. So here's when we see who's listening. So you heard from UA earlier about the Spark research, the climate finance blind spots. There were a number of recommendations that came out in that report, and I'd like you to put them in the order that you think they should be in. So this was just the order that I've written them out. That's not our top number one. It shouldn't be number one at the end. But it says revised donor modalities to provide capacity building for climate change adaptation. So more kind of funding instruments from donors. And this is thinking about fragile places in particular. Revised donor modalities to provide, I think we've got that in twice, sorry. Support for improved public financial management systems, so PFM. It seems to kind of come in and out of development fashion. Should it be coming back up the ranks again? Should we be investing more in governance and getting more PFM specialists? I've heard and done some work with people that are doing climate budget analysis and gender climate budget analysis. Do we need to get much more kind of zoomed into this? And then the last one is explore how the access requirements to multilateral climate funds could be adapted for fragile contexts. And we've started to see a little bit of a change in the language around how multilaterals might try and reduce a bit of red tape and become a bit more accessible. We know that that's actually really tricky. It's a very difficult space that we're in. So the rankings are changing. The first one is more capacity building for climate change adaptation. And I think that came out a lot in the presentations. There's huge bottlenecks, both at the national level within governments and at the local level. And it's that traditional approach to development around capacity building, around what do we mean by climate adaptation. Again, Sajan said in his presentation that a lot of people just didn't know how to build in climate into a department that wasn't the Department for the Environment. So how do we work with the Department for Health? How do we work with the Department for Finance? These things are all answerable, and there's plenty to do. So the rankings have changed again. And we're getting more responses. So thank you, everybody, for giving us your thoughts. We've got about 10 minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any questions. If anybody has any questions in the room. If you do, come up and grab a mic and come and tell us who you are and introduce yourself. And if there's any online, we'll pick those up as we go along. And if we don't have a question, I'd like to just run round our fantastic panel and just ask them one question. With a humanitarian hat on, what one thing would you change to enhance the impact of adaptation finance? What's your golden nugget? Which one thing would really make a difference in the world? And I'm going to go to Yusuf first. Yusuf, what one thing would you change?
Thank you very much. I would say that more voice of the communities who are impacted or are going to impact from the climate change, they should have voice in the design, in the decisions, which is going to have impact in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. And Christina, let's come to you. What one thing would you change that would enhance the impact of climate finance in the programs and projects that you deliver with Plan?
Well, I think we need to understand a little bit more how it's affecting, especially children's and adolescents and women and girls. One of the things that I change is to promote more finances to these groups, to be people who are more empowered to make changes. So if we help them, if we finance and have donations for empower these peoples and make more tools, give them more tools and give them more information and more spaces to discussion, I think we can make a better job together.
That's great advice, Christina. And Sajan, what one thing would you change?
Yeah, I'd like to speak about two dimensions, like building the capacity and devising risk reduction climate adaptation certainly needs to have economic development aspect on it, so that the communities or the people who are facing the risk or who are on the front face of this risk, certainly they need to build themselves economically so that they can additionally on site build their resilience. Yes, Lizzie.
Thanks, Sajan. And Yue, let's come to you. What would you change?
I will say locally led adaptation. I know this is a concept that we're always repeating, maybe even ad nauseum, but I really believe it's the most important thing. And if you think about especially this kind of like very complex context, local governments, local organizations, CSO, community organizations are the ones that are actually delivering the work anyway. But the problem is that they are not having direct access to the pot of money, so they're not calling the shots. And I think this has to change. Thank you.
Thanks, Yue. You remind me of the videos that we put out at Mercy Corps. If you look on the Mercy Corps Europe website, it's all about videos where our staff are calling COP and they say, "Take me off mute." And I think that is what we have to do. We have to let people be part of the decision, and we have to listen to a different set of people. So I'd like to just wrap up now. Oh, actually, I think we've got a question in the room. So let me just pass the mic. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us your question, please?
Sure. You can hear me? No? How about now? Still no? Hi, yes. My name is Gavin White from the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. So we're an initiative that gathers a lot of governments, civil society organizations, UN agencies, and our role is to connect these different actors around early action. So this topic is really very important for us, and I'd be curious to know from the speakers if they had the opportunity to be kind of in our role where we engage with governments. There are the donor governments, and we're constantly engaging with them, asking for more funds, trying to increase the amount that goes to adaptation. But there's another audience, which is national governments, who have limited resources, but actually those limited resources could potentially be used for these different audiences that we heard about tonight. So I'm just wondering what would be their ask to their national governments, not the donors, but the national governments on the projects that they're running. What would make a difference for them?
Great, thanks, Gavin. And lots of the Zurich partners are actually members of REAP, so well done on growing so big so fast. Let's ask Yusuf to see if he can answer that question, and then maybe Christina. So Yusuf, if you could speak to your own national government in Malawi. I know that their resources are limited, but what would you ask them to do with the resources that they do have for adaptation?
Our ask to the government is that they have to lead. They should be on the driving seat. And whatever resources which are coming from donors, they should use that resources and develop like national level platforms, which are very well linked with from the community to the district to national level, and are able to provide timely warning or weather-related information to the vulnerable communities. And we believe that's the role of the government. Donors and NGOs, we can provide technical assistance, but they have to lead. Thank you.
Thanks, Yusuf. So leading and providing and translating information and getting it to their citizens in a way that makes sense at the right time. Christina, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I would like to think, for example, I think that we need to move from a response with a response vision to a prospective vision, and start to invest on things that will be more continuous. Because sometimes where investment responds to emergencies, to respond to the impacts, but we are not working enough to prevent this impact and make more adaptation. Also, I think we need to improve the coordination and empowerment of local disaster management. This includes more money for early warning systems, for more pre-action, and as we said before, we need more spaces and more mechanisms that let our people of the communities, girl, boy, elderly, everyone, be part of the decision making.
Thanks, Christina. So moving from response mode into prevent mode, and we heard at a side event earlier on in the week that some of these countries that are in the most vulnerable state never get out of emergency mode. So they're just running from one emergency to the next, or they overlap and they collide, and we need to remember that. We've got another question in the room. Shall we just move the mic to Rachel?
Hi, thank you very much. Hi, my name's Rebecca from the Overseas Development Institute. So my sort of question / comment relates to the scale that we're talking about for adaptation planning. So I completely agree that we definitely need to be thinking about it at the local level, but also in some of these contexts that we're talking about, actually we're talking about transboundary issues. So many of the many of natural resources, for example, are shared across regional boundaries within a country, but also national boundaries. So perhaps it's not either or. Perhaps we need to be not moving away, but thinking about the national, but definitely thinking about the local, but actually now expanding our thoughts and thinking about it on the transboundary side. And then one other sort of point that I think is the sort of climate adaptation resilience community needs to think a little bit more about is maladaptation. Not just from adaptation initiatives, but also mitigation initiatives. I think we need to be sure that when we're, for example, putting in microsolar grids or something, we're not putting those in contested areas, that we're taking into consideration others. So I just welcome the panel's thoughts on those. Perhaps we need a little bit more analysis of some of the gaps and challenges.
Thanks, Rebecca. And maybe just before you pass the mic off, do you want to just explain maladaptation? So some of our listeners might not have that word in their memory banks yet.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sorry, apologies. So by maladaptation, I mean where we create and implement an intervention to address one set of hazards or reduce risk to one community, but you actually then shift the risk to another set. So a very simple example might be damming a river to create irrigation, where you would divert water resources from one community to another. But at a sort of more global scale, for example, one country might decide that it's no longer exporting rice or other crops to another country, and then this can create price shocks in those other countries.
Thank you. I know that in Nepal, some of our work is actually at the boundary of Nepal and India, and we're working with communities on one side, but nobody's working with communities on the other. But maybe, Yusuf, have you seen any examples with concern in Malawi of any cross political boundary work, any transboundary work, any ideas that you might have, or anything, a comment on the maladaptation point?
Sure. Thank you. I will start with maladaptation. Like for all our initiatives or our projects, we do operate on do no harm principle. We see before we at the design and implementation that we are aware of that there is no negative impact of our programs on the communities we are working with, as well as with the environment, nature, and also with the neighboring communities or districts. So that's one of the main principles which we abide by. Looking at cross-border, within Malawi, there are several initiatives, like for example, with national parks and protection of natural resources or protection of animals. There are several initiatives which are cross-border. And also going forward, like what we see even now, like for example, Cyclone, which it was not only Malawi, it hit Mozambique and Zimbabwe as well. So for early action, warning, as well as response and program interventions, we definitely need to look at those points. So that was a very good comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Yusuf. There's maybe something to learn from the conservation world around some of the transboundary issues. Yue, did you see anything in the research that you did? Was there any hint of any transboundary funding flows across different countries, or was it all country specific?
There was, but our research has specifically focused on national funding because actually it is hard to track data for regional programs and attribute them to different donors. But I think regional programs are really important also as a way to get around some of the challenges, especially regarding data. which is one of the points that I made before, right? So if you're missing data for one country, say climate data over the next 30 to 50 years, perhaps you can have better data at the regional level. So that allows you to basically put in proposal for regional programs.
Thanks, Yue. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up there. I must just say that I've been really inspired by hearing from all of our ZIFRA partners, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and our guest as well, Yue. Thank you for joining us. So Yusuf, Sajan and Christina, keep doing the good work that you're doing. There's a huge amount of reference material on the Flood Resilience portal, so please do visit it. Come and ask us any questions and join with us later if you want to follow up on anything around flood resilience. And a huge thanks to the Zurich Foundation for funding all of that great work and the impact that we're having. So good luck to everybody for the last few days at COP. Safe travels, everybody, and thank you for joining. Good night.